Global conflicts and turmoil have forced many people to flee their homelands and to go to other countries, including the United States. Global conflicts have also fueled terrorism and racism. In Chapter 13, you will learn about two more ethnic groups in America. First, the Vietnamese Americans who immigrated from Southeast Asia, and second, the Arab Americans who immigrated from the Middle East and North Africa. You will also learn of the resurgence of racism. Between 1960 and 1990s, hate crimes against several groups were reported to be at record levels. Crimes such as harassment, vandalism, and assaults were reported by Jews, Latinos, and various Asian groups. Let's begin by looking at the Vietnamese Americans. For the Vietnamese, under the Geneva Agreement of 1954, Vietnam was partitioned into North and South Vietnam. People were allowed to choose whether they wished to live in North or the South. Once that was determined, there was a group called the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong. They launched a guerrilla war. This war included Cambodia and Laos, and several hundreds of thousands of people were uprooted. It suddenly ended in 1975 when the South Vietnamese army collapsed. Two-thirds of the refugees arrived in the United States after 1981. For the Arab Americans, the first period of immigration of Arabs to America began in the late 1870s, to the passage of the Immigration Quota Act of 1924. Most or many of those immigrants were single men who came to earn money to improve the economic finances for their families. Then they came back with their wives and other family members. After World War II, many people were displaced or were refugees from communist countries. The Displaced Persons Act of 1948, Refugee Relief Act of 1953, the Presidential Parole Authority, the Migration and Refugee Act of 1962 were the laws passed under several presidents through 1962. They allowed hundreds of thousands of them to immigrate under refugee status. Throughout the 60s and the 70s, wars in Vietnam and other parts of Indochina created millions of new refugees that wanted to start new lives in other countries. The Refugees Act of 1980 intended to establish a systematic procedure for the admissions and effective resettlement of refugees of special humanitarian concerns to the United States. More than 780,000 Cubans and 725,000 Indo-Chinese became U.S. citizens, and other refugees have come from various parts of the world. In the 1860s, Vietnam came under French rule unwillingly. From 1945 to 1975, Vietnam has been involved in violent conflict. Under the Geneva Agreement of 1954, Vietnam was divided into two countries. People were allowed to select whether they wished to live in North or South Vietnam. Between 800,000 to 1 million people migrated from the north to the south, and most of these were Catholics. After South Vietnam was established, a group called the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong, launched a guerrilla war within South Vietnam. The war centered on Vietnam, however, it included Cambodia and Laos. By 1975, it suddenly ended when the South Vietnamese army collapsed. The U.S. had begun to pull troops earlier than 1975. Fighting continued after the American forces were gone. The new government engaged in violent conflict against the Hmong people of the mountain regions and harassed the Chinese Laotians. Thousands fled or were encamped in Thailand. In Cambodia, the new ruler, Pol Pot, relocated and slaughtered at least 1 million Cambodians. Many others were relocated and thousands fled in small boats. Many of the boat people, those that survived, were displaced in other countries such as Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, and Thailand. From 1981 to 2000, over 560,000 Vietnamese came to the United States, totaling 744,422 Vietnamese since 1951. The Vietnamese were scattered to every state in the nation, and many others were still awaiting new homes. The last wave of refugees to arrive in the United States was as recent as the mid 2000s. Let's consider the assimilation process for the Vietnamese. For successful assimilation to occur, one must have good command of the English language. They should have attained educational levels that will help them succeed in the workforce, and as part of the immigration process, mutual ethnic and family support with finances when the group arrives influences the rate of assimilation. Studies conducted indicate that the Vietnamese gain proficiency within a 5-year period. Children in the public schools are performing reasonably in the public schools now. The study also found that the refugees had immigrated or that immigrated in the early years were professionals such as doctors and lawyers, managers. Those that came later were peasants and unskilled laborers and farmers. When we look at incomes for the Vietnamese compared to other groups, Montero in 1979 found that the annual median income of refugee households was about 70% of the U.S. average. By 1990, the labor force participation was almost equal to that of the United States as a whole. It appears that the Vietnamese have achieved a fairly high level of financial self-sufficiency. In an effort to maintain contacts with family members and other nationals from their country, they will move from their original location to other places that have larger Vietnamese populations. California is one of their destinations. As far as marital assimilation goes, the Vietnamese have a very low rate of out-marriages among the refugees within the United States. We can conclude that the Vietnamese appear to be undergoing rapid cultural assimilation. Their rates of naturalization are higher than the average of all immigrants, 58% versus 46%, and equal to the Chinese immigrants. 200 million Arabs live in the Middle East and North Africa. We know they share a common language, even though they have different dialects and the religion of Islam. They do live in different countries and have different interpretations of Islam. The people from the Arabian Peninsula were nomadic, and the Arab civilization grew from their lives and the culture that they had established. The Prophet Muhammad, who was born in Mecca, led to the religious and political alliances of Arabia and the expansion of Arab culture beyond the peninsula. From the early years, Arab people faced internal challenges. Two branches of Islamic beliefs and practices were set up, the Sunni and the Shia. The Ottoman Empire was created and their rule lasted until 1918. World War I saw the defeat of Turkey and the empire collapsed. The Middle East was divided and different allied countries received orders to supervise these territories until they were considered them to be ready to be independent. American involvement during the 19th century came in the form of missionary groups and labor recruitment. As stated before previously, Arab American immigrants were single men who eventually returned from their journey in America only to quickly return from their homeland back to America with their wives and other family members. Upon their return, they faced prejudice from the natives, and despite that, they assimilated quickly. They were naturalized and given citizenship. The second generation of Arab Americans, known as Syrian Americans, have been born and were assimilating at every level. Arab communities were mainly in urban areas across the country. They were replicas of traditional communities, families, and religious route as they had in their homeland. Some chose to work in factories, mining, and agriculture. However, for many, peddling became the way of life. They did not want to compete for jobs with their own people, so they spread out among or around the country, setting up shops, eventually establishing their businesses. Immigration for the Arab community in the third stream was pretty typical. They came because they were dissatisfied with the homeland. There were wars, economic conditions that contributed to their coming. Many were highly educated from the different countries. Studies show that between 1980 and 1990, there were more than 1 million Arabs living in large cities such as Detroit, Dearborn, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, to name a few. Culturally, Arab Americans are assimilating at a high rate among those born in America. Their command of the English language is strong. For those born in America, their level of income is higher than the average American. They are more likely to hold professional or managerial occupations. In regard to marital assimilation, very few Arab Americans, Christian or Muslim, consider intermarriage to be sought after. There does appear to be some resistance among Muslims. However, among native-born Arab Americans, studies show that 80% have married out. Discrimination against Arab Americans have been a problem. Their identificational assimilation into American life became significant following the Arab-Israeli War of 1967. Arab communities used oil as a bargaining tool, and Islamic extremist groups responded to Western support for Israel. There was an increase of prejudice toward people of Arab ancestry in the United States. Under Operation Boulder, a wide-scale operation to monitor the Arab community began in 1972. That is when they came under federal watch. This was fueled by xenophobia and nativism among Americans, as well as increases in individual and official hostility toward this particular group of immigrants. In 2003, the FBI created an Arab American Advisory Committee to improve relations. There have been several terrorist acts against Western targets. In 1995, when the Murrah Federal Building was destroyed by a bomb in Oklahoma City, many people assumed the attack was the work of Islamic terrorists. There were over 200 hate crimes against Arab and Muslim Americans within the next 3 days. The tragic attacks of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on September the 11th, 2001, brought out a question. Might we again use a national crisis as a pretext for condemning and prosecuting an entire ethnic group? Hopefully not. The natives' reactions to those that immigrated to the United States has been negative, and with each immigration stream, we saw an increase in that negativism. During the third great immigrant stream, there seemed to be an increase in the feeling that there should be a reduction of immigrants coming to the United States. Hate crimes against members of several minority groups increased during this period. During the 1990s, hate crimes against some groups were reported to be at record levels. There was harassment, vandalism, and assaults aimed at Jews, Latinos, and various Asian groups. In 2003, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified over 700 active hate groups in the United States. The neo-Nazis have over 200 organizations, and the Ku Klux Klan have over 133, or to be exact, organizations. California and Texas have the most of any state with 48 each. And since 2003, there have been increases in active hate groups. Last year, in 2013, was the first decrease with just under 1,000 hate groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center tracked for that year. Please check out the website to see the hate group or the hate map, which indicates the location of the hate groups in each state. Following the September 11, 2001 attacks of the U.S., Arabs and Muslims, as well as people who resemble them, became the primary targets of xenophobia hatred. Several people were murdered in hate attacks. There were over 600 reported violent incidents and direct threats of violence. Many Americans, individuals, and groups found ways to express their support, even posting signs in their yards advocating tolerance towards Arabs and Muslim Americans. The feds issued statements asking all Americans to draw a clear distinction between aligning collective and individual guilt, between blaming the many patriotic Arabs and Muslim Americans who were in no way connected to the 9/11 attacks and the few Arab Muslims who were actually responsible for those attacks. The passage of the U.S. Patriot Act of 2001 has left many people concerned. The main concern in the area of administrative policy has been that the government may try accused people in military tribunals, deny them counsel, hold them incommunicado and indefinitely, and eavesdropped on client-attorney communications. Enormous care needs to be put into effect to prevent national security from acting as a mask for discrimination and pushing the United States into the abyss of racism. We've been there before. As we come to the end of this chapter, I again have some questions to consider. How did the refugees' status of the Vietnamese affect their entrance into American society? And the second question, what are the long-range effects of September 11th on American racism?